I call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I speak with respect to the report on MB, particularly that conducted by the Commerce Select Committee. And at that meeting, among a number of things, we talked about our programs and progress around research and development growth. And I particularly want to speak in relation to some points that Mr Fletcher Tabito of New Zealand First raised just a wee bit earlier in this debate. So Mr Tabito acknowledged that business contribution, private sector business contribution to research and development in the last 12 months or so had grown by 29%. That is very true, 29%. Mr Chair, you would think that would be something to be proud of and to raise and laud as something good for the country. But Mr Tabito didn't. That might come as some surprise, but you know, New Zealand First members are often known to defy common sense and logic, so it possibly didn't come as too much of a shock to members on this side of the House. Because what it did show is that Mr Tabito does not understand this government's R&D plan, nor does he understand the R&D objectives of any countries in the OECD. You see, because it is the intention of countries, small developing countries or large and advanced countries, for the private sector to bear a greater burden of the R&D investment. There are generally two things that countries are looking to achieve. Generally, they want to grow their R&D expenditure to around 2.5% or more of GDP, and they want business to have the lion's share of that. Now, in New Zealand, and if Mr Tabito had actually sat on the Commerce Committee, Select Committee, instead of just pontificating from his seat over there, he would know that the report from MB shows that the level of government R&D investment in New Zealand is considered very strong within the OECD, particularly given that we are considered a small advanced nation, of course, and not one of the larger ones. And so when we have a situation where the private sector business investment in R&D is outstripping the government investment in R&D, that is actually a good thing. It's a good thing because it shows that we are getting closer to the objective of not only growing overall research and development expenditure, but having the private sector contributing a greater amount towards that. So, Mr Chair, overall the news we got from MB around that was that they are pleased that there is a greater propensity or a greater willingness for business to invest, but we still have a way to go. And another area they pointed out that we have a way to go in is the commercialisation of that R&D. And it's with some note, we might note then that the change to the CE of Callaghan Innovation is someone who's got proven experience in the private sector and has been brought on to help to exploit, so that help companies in New Zealand to exploit that R&D investment further. Now, the other part I'd like to touch upon is in one of the other reports, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise came to talk to us. Because as a small trading nation at the bottom of the world, who no one owes a living, we are wholly dependent on exports for the prosperity of New Zealanders. So when we're trading with other nations, Mr Chair, it's not actually about commodities or the goods or the services, it's actually about jobs and income. Because the more trade avenues we have and the fewer barriers we have for our goods and services to be traded overseas, the more jobs we create in New Zealand and the higher incomes are raised for the workers in those areas. So we heard from NZTE, whose job is to help Kiwis act upon and exploit the free trade agreements which people like the Honourable Todd McClay work so hard to put in place around the world. And I would acknowledge the work that Mr McClay has been doing to put in perhaps a new form, but to salvage some very positive trade outcomes from all of those TPP negotiations and progress that was made up until the very late part of last year. But it's NZTE's job to help New Zealand companies to actually capitalise upon those. And they particularly have been doing a lot of work around a group of 700-odd companies who are actually not the largest enterprises in New Zealand, companies that are smaller than $500 million a year revenue, and they're helping them to actually engage in those markets to grow their opportunities and to convert those free trade agreements into jobs and higher incomes through the provision of more products and services. And they have been doing an extremely good job. In fact, they were talking to us that they were engaged with about $1.5 billion worth of overseas activity. So great work all round in the economic development sector.
Ko Elsa Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.